December 9th, 1946. Courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. 23 men sit in the dock wearing dark suits and translation headphones. All of them are doctors. Most held prestigious positions at Germany's finest universities and hospitals. Some directed entire medical programs for the Reich. They are surrounded by American military police. At the prosecution table, Brigadier General Telford Taylor rises. Behind him, assistants wheel in metal carts stacked with document boxes. Hundreds of files, thousands of pages, photographs that will make grown men look away. And then the prosecutors begin reading names into the record. Not the names of the defendants, the names of their victims, child after child, prisoner after prisoner, each name attached to a file documenting how they died. The reading goes on for hours, more than 300 individual cases presented in a single session. Some of the doctors in the dock shift in their seats. Others stare straight ahead, expressionless. One removes his headphones. Another's hands begin to tremble as his own signature appears on a document projected onto the courtroom wall. These men once represented the pinnacle of German medicine. Now they are facing evidence of systematic mass murder conducted under the guise of science. 10 years earlier, these same doctors took an oath. First, do no harm. Now, American prosecutors are about to prove they designed, implemented, and enthusiastically participated in a program that killed hundreds of thousands. How did physicians, bound by the most sacred ethical code in civilization, become architects of industrial-scale murder? And what happened in this courtroom over the next 9 months that finally shattered every defense they could mount? This wasn't about a few rogue killers in white coats. This was about an entire system where medicine fused with ideology to create something history had never seen. A profession dedicated to healing transformed into an engine of death, operating with scientific precision and bureaucratic efficiency. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how American prosecutors dismantled that defense piece by piece, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through a series of evidentiary exhibits so damning, so meticulously documented, that denial became impossible. I'm going to walk you through 8 categories of evidence presented at this trial, 8 types of proof that built on each other, each one removing another layer of the defendant's claims of ignorance. And here's what you need to understand before we begin. These revelations were connected. Each category of evidence made the next one harder to explain away. Each exhibit put the defendants in a tighter corner. By the time prosecutors rested their case in February 1947, the doctors weren't just facing conviction. They were facing the complete moral collapse of every justification they constructed. So the question isn't whether these doctors committed crimes. The evidence made that undeniable. The question is how prosecutors proved it so thoroughly that it changed medical ethics forever and created legal principles still used today. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why this trial matters more now than ever. But first, we need to talk about the single piece of evidence that set the tone for everything that followed: the prosecution's opening move. Before we go further, if you're interested in deep historical analysis of the Nuremberg trials and how evidence shaped international law and medical ethics, I'd really appreciate if you'd hit that subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. And as we go through these 8 categories of evidence, drop a comment telling me which one you think was the most disturbing. I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. All right, let's get into it. December 9th, 1946. Opening day of the trial. Brigadier General Telford Taylor stands before the tribunal. He doesn't begin with emotional appeals or moral outrage. He begins with a document, a single memorandum dated October 1939. Signed by Adolf Hitler. The document authorizes Reich leader Philipp Bauer and Dr. Karl Brandt to expand the authority of certain physicians to grant a mercy death to patients considered incurable according to the best available human judgment. That's the language: mercy death, incurable patients, human judgment, clinical, bureaucratic, antiseptic. Taylor holds up the document. Then he holds up another one, and another, a cascade of paperwork, orders, memos, budget allocations, personnel assignments, medical evaluations, death certificates. The prosecution's message is immediate and devastating. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't improvisation. This was administration. Let me show you what these documents revealed. The T4 program, named after its headquarters address at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, was a fully staffed bureaucratic apparatus. It had department heads, secretarial staff, filing systems, standardized forms with carbon copies, procurement officers who ordered the gas canisters, accountants who tracked the costs per victim, personnel managers who hired the doctors, nurses, and orderlies. Everything documented, everything approved, everything signed. The prosecutors presented organizational charts. They showed how the program worked. Medical institutions across Germany would identify patients deemed unworthy of life. They would fill out forms. Multiple physicians would sign off. The forms would be sent to Berlin, where 3 reviewing doctors, working independently, would mark each case with a plus or minus sign. Plus meant death. 3 pluses, and the patient would be transferred to one of 6 killing centers. But here's what made this evidence so devastating. The defendants in the dock were the men who designed the system. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, coordinated the entire operation. Victor Brack administered the program. Other defendants served as reviewing physicians, signed the transfer orders, selected the killing methods, trained the staff. Their signatures appeared on document after document. Personnel files showed their promotions, salary increases, and commendations for efficiency. The defense tried to argue they were following orders, that they had no choice. But the paper trail revealed something else entirely. Initiative, enthusiasm, competition for resources and authority, doctors writing memos proposing expansions of the program, requests to broaden the criteria for who could be killed, suggestions for more efficient methods. One document showed a doctor complaining that his facility's quota was too low. Another requested additional funding for a larger gas chamber. A third asked permission to include children as young as 3, rather than the initial cutoff of infants and toddlers. These weren't men being coerced. These were professionals building careers. The prosecutors also presented the financial records. The T4 program had a budget. It paid salaries. It reimbursed travel expenses. Doctors who participated received bonuses. One defendant's bank records showed regular deposits corresponding exactly to the dates when transports of patients arrived at his facility. Another's tax returns listed income from special consultative services to the Reich. The bureaucratic apparatus of murder was also the apparatus of compensation and career advancement. And here's what the prosecutors understood. These documents did something emotional testimony alone couldn't do. They proved system. They proved planning. They proved that every defendant knew exactly what they were participating in, because they signed off on it, month after month, year after year. But documents can be cold, abstract, numbers on a page. The prosecution knew that. So once they established the system existed, they moved to the next category of evidence, the one that would make the courtroom go silent, the one that transformed bureaucratic language into human reality. They were about to show the tribunal what those signatures actually meant, what happened to the people whose names appeared on those transfer forms. And that's where the second revelation came in. The evidence that this so-called mercy death program was designed not to end suffering, but to perfect methods of killing, methods that would later be used on an even larger scale. Spring 1942. A document enters the trial record that changes everything. It's a research proposal from Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a Luftwaffe physician. The proposal is addressed to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. It requests permission to use concentration camp prisoners for high-altitude experiments. The stated purpose? To help German pilots survive bailouts at extreme altitude. The actual design? Place prisoners in a low-pressure chamber, simulating altitudes up to 68, 0 feet, and observe what happens when the human body is deprived of oxygen. The prosecution presents the results. Detailed medical reports, charts tracking heart rate, respiration, and brain activity as subjects lost consciousness, photographs of prisoners in the chamber, faces contorted, autopsy reports documenting cause of death. Approximately 80 prisoners were subjected to these experiments. About 1/3 died during the tests. But here's what made this evidence so damning. The experiments had no scientific value. Professional aviation medicine already knew the effects of high-altitude exposure. Allied air forces had conducted ethical tests using volunteers with proper safety equipment. The data from Rascher's experiments was so poorly controlled, so contaminated by the subject's prior starvation and disease, that it was medically worthless. So why conduct them? The prosecutors presented a different theory. These weren't experiments. They were executions with documentation. The research was a pretext, a way to legitimize killing while satisfying intellectual curiosity about the exact mechanism of death. And the high-altitude tests were just the beginning. The tribunal heard evidence of freezing experiments conducted at Dachau concentration camp. Prisoners were immersed in tanks of ice water for up to 5 hours. Core body temperature was monitored as it dropped. Subjects were observed as they went into shock, lost consciousness, and died. The stated purpose: to develop revival techniques for Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the North Sea. Dr. Rascher, again the principal investigator, documented approximately 300 experiments. Mortality rate, roughly 50%. But here's what the prosecution emphasized. No revival technique was ever developed. No life-saving protocol emerged. Instead, the experiments tested increasingly bizarre warming methods, including forcing hypothermic prisoners into bed with female prisoners to test whether body heat transfer worked. The defense tried to argue these were legitimate military research under wartime conditions. The prosecution countered with a simple question. If these were legitimate experiments, why were the subjects never volunteers? Why were they prisoners who had no choice? Why was there no anesthesia, no pain control, no attempt to minimize suffering? And then came the infection experiments. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, one of the most prominent defendants, conducted experiments at Ravensbrück concentration camp on female prisoners. The stated purpose? To test the effectiveness of sulfonamide drugs in treating battlefield wounds. The method? Deliberately infect healthy prisoners with bacteria, introduce wood shavings and glass fragments to simulate battlefield contamination, then attempt treatment. Prosecutors presented testimony from survivors, women who had their legs cut open, infected with gas gangrene, streptococcus, and tetanus, who were left untreated for days to allow infections to worsen, who watched as other prisoners in the same ward died screaming. 75 women were subjected to these experiments. At least 15 died. Many others suffered permanent disability, losing limbs to amputation. But again, the prosecution asked the critical question, what medical knowledge was gained? German military medicine already knew sulfonamides were effective against infection. Allied forces were already using them successfully. These experiments produced no new data, no breakthrough treatments, no advancement in wound care. What they did produce was suffering, documented, photographed, measured suffering, and careers. Dr. Gebhardt presented his findings at a medical conference in Berlin in May 1943, where he was praised by colleagues for his pioneering work in battlefield medicine. The prosecution also presented evidence of sterilization experiments conducted at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Dr. Horst Schumann used high-dose X-rays to destroy the reproductive capacity of prisoners. Dr. Karl Klauberg injected chemical irritants directly into the uteruses of women. Both justified their work as research into efficient mass sterilization methods for racial hygiene purposes. Hundreds of prisoners were subjected to these procedures. Many died from infections or radiation poisoning. Survivors were left sterilized, often with severe internal damage and chronic pain. And here's what tied all of these experiments together. None of them were designed to save lives. They were designed to perfect methods of control, harm, and killing. High-altitude and freezing experiments taught German doctors the exact thresholds of human endurance before death. Infection experiments demonstrated how to induce fatal disease. Sterilization experiments developed techniques for eliminating populations without mass killing. The prosecution's case was clear. This wasn't science. This was systematic investigation of how to destroy human beings efficiently. And every one of these experiments required medical expertise, required trained physicians to design protocols, monitor subjects, interpret results, and document findings. The defendants sat in the dock listening as prosecutors read clinical descriptions from their own reports. Dispassionate medical language describing agony, charts showing survival times, photographs of victims labeled only with prisoner numbers. Their own words, their own data, now evidence of murder. But the defense wasn't finished. They argued these were prisoners already sentenced to death, that using them for research was a humanitarian act giving meaning to their deaths, that wartime necessity justified extreme measures, that the prisoners were enemies of the Reich and therefore not protected by medical ethics. The prosecution was ready for every one of those arguments because they had evidence showing something the defendants desperately wanted to hide. Evidence that the victims weren't enemy soldiers or convicted criminals. They were children, disabled children, German children. And that's where the third revelation came in. The one that would prove these doctors weren't protecting Germany. They were killing its most vulnerable citizens. January 1947. The prosecution calls a witness, a German midwife from Bavaria. She takes the stand and describes something that still haunts historians today, a program where parents were told their disabled children would receive special care at advanced medical facilities, where those children were then systematically killed. The witness describes a case from 1941. A young couple gave birth to a son with Down syndrome. A pediatrician convinced them to transfer the child to a specialized clinic for comprehensive treatment. The parents received letters for several weeks describing the child's progress. Then, a brief notification. Their son had died suddenly of pneumonia. When the body was returned for burial, the mother noticed something. The child's body was still warm. He hadn't died days earlier, as the death certificate claimed. He had been killed that morning, right before transport. The tribunal hears this testimony in complete silence. Then the prosecution presents documentation proving this wasn't an isolated incident. This was policy. Official Reich policy for the systematic killing of children deemed unworthy of life. Worse, the program began in 1939 with a secret directive. All midwives and physicians were required to report infants born with serious disabilities or deformities. The reports went to the Reich Committee for the Scientific Registering of Serious Hereditary and Congenital Illnesses, another bureaucratic name for another apparatus of murder. Prosecutors present the reporting forms. Standardized questionnaires asking about specific conditions, Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, microcephaly, limb deformities, epilepsy. The forms had boxes to check and spaces for clinical descriptions. At the bottom, a line for the reporting physician's signature. Once reported, the children were flagged by a committee of 3 physicians in Berlin who reviewed each case. If all 3 agreed the child met the criteria for life unworthy of life, the family would be contacted. The approach was always the same, a kindly letter explaining that specialized treatment was available at a state-run facility, that the child would receive excellent care, that costs would be covered by the Reich. Most families, trusting their doctors, agreed to the transfer. The prosecution presents testimony from a nurse who worked at one of these facilities, the Spiegelgrund Clinic in Vienna. She describes the routine. Children would arrive by transport. They'd be examined, photographed, and measured. Then, after a period of observation, they would be given a lethal injection or administered overdoses of sedatives. Death would be recorded as pneumonia, heart failure, or another natural cause. The bodies weren't simply buried. Prosecutors present evidence that shocked even the hardened military judges. The children's brains were systematically harvested and preserved for research. Hundreds of specimens labeled and stored in jars, cataloged by diagnosis. The clinic director, Dr. Heinrich Gross, maintained an extensive collection. He published papers based on this research and received academic recognition for his contributions to pediatric neuropathology. Let me be very clear about the scale. Between 1939 and 1945, the child euthanasia program killed at leist 5 Zuhausen children. The actual number is likely much higher, as many records were destroyed. These weren't enemy prisoners. These weren't foreign nationals. These were German children, citizens of the Reich, killed by German doctors in German hospitals. The defense tried to argue this was euthanasia in the true sense, ending unbearable suffering, mercy for children with no hope of meaningful life. The prosecution demolished that argument with a single category of evidence: medical files from the program showing the criteria for killing. Children were killed for bedwetting beyond age 3, for difficult behavior, for being uneducable, for minor physical deformities that caused no medical problems. One file documented a girl killed because she had slightly malformed ears and a limp. Another described a boy killed for general learning difficulties, who had been attending regular school. These weren't children on death's door. These were children who were inconvenient, who required extra resources, who didn't fit the Nazi vision of biological perfection. The prosecution also presented evidence of how the program expanded. Initially limited to infants and toddlers, it gradually extended to older children, then to adolescents. By 1943, facilities were accepting teenagers deemed socially undesirable. The criteria kept broadening. The definitions kept expanding. The bureaucratic machinery kept processing more victims. And here's what made this evidence particularly devastating for the defendants. Many of them had argued they participated in concentration camp experiments because the victims were criminals or enemies of the state. But these children? These were patients, under the care of doctors who had taken oaths to protect them. The prosecution read from the Hippocratic Oath, the fundamental principle that physicians must do no harm. Then they presented file after file of doctors systematically violating that principle, not under duress, not under threat of punishment, but as a routine part of their professional duties. Some defendants tried to distance themselves from the child program. They claimed they only participated in concentration camp research, as if that was somehow more defensible. But prosecutors showed the connection. The same doctors who served on the committees selecting children for death also selected prisoners for experiments. The same physicians who injected children with lethal doses also infected prisoners with deadly diseases. The same bureaucratic apparatus administered both programs. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the coordinator of the entire euthanasia program, testified that he believed the killings were a purely medical problem, that physicians were best qualified to determine life unworthy of life, that this was a humanitarian program to spare suffering. The prosecution responded by projecting photographs onto the courtroom wall, images of the children, not deformed monsters, not barely alive medical anomalies, children smiling in some photos, holding toys, looking directly at the camera with normal human expressions. And then the prosecutors revealed something that made several defendants visibly react: letters from parents. Dozens of letters to the Reich Committee begging for information about their children. Letters that were filed away and never answered. Letters from mothers asking if they could visit. Letters from fathers requesting the return of their child's belongings. Letters that demonstrated beyond question that these families didn't consent to their children's murders. One defendant, Victor Brack, had testified that the program was voluntary, that families supported it. The prosecution read aloud a letter from a mother whose son had been killed at Hadamar facility. She had grown suspicious when her weekly letters to the boy suddenly stopped being answered. She went to the facility unannounced and demanded to see her son. She was told he had died 2 weeks earlier of appendicitis. She demanded an autopsy. The facility refused. She went to local police. An investigation revealed her son had been killed by injection the day after he arrived. He'd been in perfect health. The defendants had no answer for this, no legal theory, no medical ethics framework, no wartime necessity argument that could justify killing disabled children whose parents wanted them to live. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Because the child euthanasia program was just the visible surface of something larger, a systematic program that eventually killed over 70 untouchable people, adults in psychiatric hospitals, elderly patients in nursing homes, anyone deemed a burden on the Reich's resources. And that's where the fourth revelation came in, evidence of how these doctors transformed hospitals into factories of death, complete with production quotas, efficiency metrics, and assembly line procedures. February 1947. The prosecution introduces a witness who worked as a bus driver for the T4 program. He describes his job with disturbing precision. Every week, he would drive a gray bus with painted-over windows to a psychiatric institution. Hospital staff would load patients aboard. He would drive them to one of 6 facilities: Hadamar, Bernburg, Grafeneck, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, Brandenburg. The patients were told they were being transferred to better facilities. Some were excited, some were confused, some resisted and had to be sedated. The driver would deliver them to a receiving area, wait while paperwork was processed, then drive the empty bus back. This happened multiple times per week after week, month after month. He testified that he transported approximately 3 untouchable people. He never saw any of them again. The prosecution then presents architectural plans for these 6 facilities, floor layouts, plumbing diagrams, ventilation systems. Each facility had been modified in the same way. A receiving room where patients were photographed and registered, an examination room where they were measured and evaluated, a changing room where they surrendered their clothing and belongings, and then a sealed chamber disguised as a shower room. The chambers were equipped with gas pipes, carbon monoxide supplied from steel cylinders. The entire process, from arrival to death, took less than 2 hours. Bodies were cremated in ovens installed specifically for this purpose. Gold dental fillings were extracted first, melted down, and sent to the Reich Treasury. Let me show you how industrial this became. The prosecution presents internal memoranda discussing capacity and efficiency. One document from Hartheim facility reports processing 269 people in 1941 alone. Another document calculates the cost savings to the Reich. Food, housing, and medical care no longer required for these individuals. The savings were expressed in Reichsmarks per person per year, multiplied by projected lifespan minus the cost of the killing operation. The memo concluded the program was economically justified. These weren't medical decisions. These were actuarial calculations, balance sheets where human lives appeared in the debit column and their deaths in the credit column. The prosecution also presents the selection criteria used by physicians reviewing cases. Patients were categorized by their ability to work. Those who could perform no labor were highest priority for killing. Those who could do simple tasks were lower priority. The medical condition itself was often irrelevant. A patient with schizophrenia who could work in the institutional laundry might live. A patient with mild depression who couldn't work would be selected for death. The defense tried to argue this was triage, allocating scarce resources during wartime. The prosecution responded with devastating evidence. Many of the institutions conducting these killings were not overcrowded. Some had empty beds immediately after transports departed. The program wasn't about freeing up space. It was about eliminating categories of people. And here's what made the evidence even more damning. The prosecution presents testimony from a physician who resigned rather than participate. Dr. Gerhard Schmidt worked at a psychiatric hospital in Brandenburg when the T4 program began. He was ordered to review patient files and mark those deemed unworthy of life. He refused. He submitted his resignation and explained his reasons in writing. He cited medical ethics, his oath as a physician, and his conscience. His resignation was accepted. He faced no punishment. He continued practicing medicine in a different position. This testimony destroyed the defendant's most critical argument, that they had no choice, that refusing orders meant death or imprisonment. Here was proof that doctors could refuse, could walk away, could say no. Some defendants shifted in their seats, others stared down at the table. Because this evidence proved they had made a choice. They chose to participate. The prosecution then presents records showing what happened at these killing facilities on a typical day. Let me walk you through the evidence from Hadamar. Morning transport arrives. 35 patients from various institutions. They're processed in groups of 10. First group enters the reception area. Names recorded, prisoner numbers assigned. Personal belongings collected and cataloged. They move to the examination room. Stripped, photographed. Doctor checks for gold teeth and marks their charts. Next, they're told they're going to the showers. They enter the sealed room. The door locks behind them. A physician opens the valve, releasing carbon monoxide. Death occurs within 10 to 20 minutes. While they're dying, the second group is being processed in the reception area. While the first group's bodies are being removed and cremated, the third group enters the gas chamber. Assembly line. 3 groups processed before lunch. The afternoon shift handles the remaining patients. By evening, all 35 are dead, cremated, and their families have been sent telegrams with false causes of death. The facility processes approximately 500 people per week using the system. The prosecution presents employment records from Hadamar. They show a staff of approximately 60 people: doctors, nurses, orderlies, clerks, crematorium operators, bus drivers. Everyone knew what was happening, everyone participated, and everyone was paid. The facility had a budget, staff received salaries, benefits, and pensions. One particularly chilling document shows a staff party held at Hadamar in August 1941 to celebrate the 10 Wammersworth victim. There are photographs, staff members posing together, smiling. Someone placed a flower arrangement on the crematorium oven. The facility director gave a speech praising the team's efficiency and dedication. This wasn't reluctant participation under threat. This was institutional culture, a workplace where mass murder was routine, celebrated, and rewarded. But here's what the prosecution emphasized. The T4 program officially ended in August 1941, not because of moral awakening, not because leadership recognized the ethical catastrophe, but because rumors had spread among the German public. Families noticed patterns. Multiple deaths at the same facilities, identical causes of death on certificates, false ashes returned to families. Several Catholic bishops preached sermons condemning the killing program. Most notably, Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen delivered a sermon in August 1941 explicitly naming the euthanasia program and calling it murder. Hitler, concerned about civilian morale and church opposition, ordered the program stopped, at least officially. The prosecution then presents evidence showing what actually happened. The formal T4 apparatus was dismantled, the bureaucratic center in Berlin was closed, but the killing continued. It just became decentralized. Individual hospitals and institutions were given authority to kill their own patients. The methods changed. Instead of gas chambers, doctors used lethal injections, deliberate starvation, and medication overdoses. This was called wild euthanasia. And it was in many ways worse because there was less oversight, less documentation, and more arbitrary decision-making by individual physicians. Patients could be killed on a single doctor's order. The prosecution presents case files from hospitals across Germany between 1941 and 1945. Patients dying of pneumonia who had no respiratory symptoms days earlier. Patients dying of heart failure who had normal cardiac function. Patients dying of exhaustion after sudden refusal of food when hospital records showed the food was deliberately withheld. One doctor testified that at his institution, elderly patients who became difficult were transferred to a special ward. Within days, they would die. The ward was known among staff as the waiting room. No patient transferred there ever left alive. By the time the formal T4 program was officially ended, it had killed approximately 70,000 Auschwitz people. The wild euthanasia phase killed at least 100,000 or more, though exact numbers are impossible to determine because documentation was deliberately sparse. The defendants in the dock had signatures on T4 documents. They had served as reviewing physicians, administrators, and facility directors. They had authorized transports, signed death certificates, and collected payments. The paper trail was complete. And now the prosecution moved to its most powerful category of evidence, the one that would make abstract numbers human, the one that would put faces and voices to the statistics. They were about to call survivor witnesses, people who had been in the camps, on the tables in the chambers, who had survived against impossible odds, and whose testimony would make it impossible for any defendant to claim they didn't know what was happening to the victims, because the victims were about to speak for themselves. February 1947. The prosecution calls its first survivor witness, a Polish woman named Jadwiga Dzido. She was a prisoner at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She walks to the witness stand with a visible limp. When asked to describe her experience, she rolls up her sleeve and shows the tribunal her leg. Deep scars running from ankle to knee, tissue damage visible even years after the injury. She testifies in Polish, through a translator. Her voice is steady but quiet. In August 1942, she was selected along with other prisoners for what the SS doctors called medical research. She describes being taken to a surgical ward, being anesthetized, waking in severe pain. Her leg had been cut open. Foreign material had been deliberately inserted into the wound. Wood fragments, glass shards, bacteria cultures. The stated purpose, she was told later, was to simulate battlefield injuries for treatment research. She received no treatment for days. The wound became infected. She developed a high fever. She watched as other women in the ward screamed from pain. 3 women in beds near her died. When treatment was finally administered, it was selective. Some women received sulfonamide drugs. Others received placebo. Some received no treatment at all. Dzido was in the placebo group. Her infection worsened. She nearly died. Only the camp's liberation saved her life. The defense attorney for Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who directed these experiments, begins cross-examination. He tries to suggest she's confused, that her memories might be distorted by trauma, that she couldn't possibly remember specific details years later. Dzido responds by naming the other women in her ward, giving their prisoner numbers. describing which ones died and which survived, recalling conversations they had, details about the doctors who examined them, specific dates of procedures. The defense attorney grows frustrated. He asks if she understood the experiments might save German soldiers' lives. She responds simply, "I was a prisoner. I did not consent. This was not medicine. This was torture." The tribunal allows her testimony to stand unchallenged. The defense has no effective response. The prosecution then calls a series of additional survivors. Each one provides testimony the defense cannot break. A Czech prisoner describes high-altitude experiments at Dachau, being locked in a pressure chamber, feeling his lungs collapse as air pressure dropped, losing consciousness, waking to find the man next to him dead. The experiments continued for weeks. Some prisoners were subjected to the chamber multiple times. Many never recovered, suffering permanent brain damage from oxygen deprivation. A French prisoner testifies about freezing experiments, being forced into a tank of ice water while doctors monitored his temperature with rectal thermometers, losing sensation in his extremities, teeth chattering so violently he bit through his tongue. The water temperature was kept just above freezing. The immersion lasted 3 hours. When he was pulled out, he couldn't walk. His core temperature had dropped so low he was clinically hypothermic. The warming methods tested on him were brutal: scalding hot water, forced physical exertion. He testified that several prisoners died during the warming phase, their hearts stopping from the shock. The defense tries different tactics with each witness. They suggest the prisoners volunteered in exchange for better food. The witnesses produce evidence this was false. One brings his prisoner card showing he was never offered anything. Another describes being selected arbitrarily during morning roll call with no explanation. The defense suggests conditions weren't as bad as described. The witnesses describe watching friends die, seeing bodies removed, hearing screams from other wards. One witness testifies he was forced to help dispose of corpses from the experiments. He carried bodies to the crematorium. He saw the extent of injuries: burns, amputations, dissections. The defense tries to suggest these were isolated incidents, not systematic programs. The prosecution responds with prisoner ledgers from multiple camps. Ravensbrück shows 86 women subjected to surgical experiments. Dachau shows approximately 200 prisoners in freezing experiments and 80 in high-altitude tests. Buchenwald shows prisoners deliberately infected with typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases. Sachsenhausen shows sterilization experiments on dozens of prisoners. Each camp had medical experiment blocks, designated areas with specialized equipment, multiple doctors participating, regular schedules. This wasn't isolated. This was institutional. One witness provides testimony that particularly affects the tribunal: a Jewish prisoner who survived experiments at Auschwitz conducted by Dr. Josef Mengele. Though Mengele isn't among the defendants, his experiments were part of the broader program. The witness describes being selected with his twin brother. Both were subjected to comparative experiments, blood transfusions between them, infectious disease tests where one twin was infected and the other observed as a control. His brother died. He survived only because Soviet forces liberated the camp before the final round of experiments. The witness testifies that Mengele kept meticulous records: photographs of twins before and after experiments, detailed measurements, autopsy reports when subjects died. He saw the filing cabinets, the labeled specimens, the systematic documentation of torture and death. The prosecution connects this testimony directly to the defendants in the courtroom. Several of them had visited camps where experiments occurred. They had reviewed research proposals. They had approved funding and resource allocation. Their signatures appeared on authorizations. They had attended conferences where results were presented. They knew. They participated. They benefited professionally from this research. The defense's only remaining argument was legal, not factual. They argued that international law at the time didn't clearly prohibit medical experiments on prisoners, that Germany was a sovereign nation entitled to make its own medical ethics decisions, that these men were being prosecuted for actions that weren't clearly illegal when committed. The prosecution was ready for this argument because they had evidence that would demolish it completely, evidence showing that these doctors knew they were violating established medical ethics, that they deliberately concealed their actions, that they understood at the time that what they were doing was criminal, and that evidence came from their own words, from internal documents never meant to be seen outside the Reich, from private letters and confidential memos where the doctors themselves acknowledged they were committing crimes. That was the sixth revelation, the language the doctors used when they thought no one was listening, the words that proved they knew exactly what they were doing and why it was wrong. March 1947. The prosecution introduces a category of evidence that changes the entire moral calculus of the trial: internal correspondence between Nazi doctors, letters, memos, and reports, never intended for public view. The language in these documents reveals something the defendants desperately tried to hide. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew it violated medical ethics. And they took deliberate steps to conceal it. Let me show you a specific example. A letter from Dr. Sigmund Rascher to Heinrich Himmler in 1942. Rascher is requesting more experimental subjects for his freezing research at Dachau. But notice the language. He doesn't write patients or even prisoners. He writes material. Human beings reduced to raw material for research. In another memo discussing high-altitude experiments, he refers to subjects who died as total failures. Not people, not victims. Failed experiments. Equipment that didn't perform as expected. The prosecution projects these documents onto the courtroom wall. The contrast is stark. In public presentations and published papers, the doctors used clinical, neutral language. In private correspondence, they revealed their true mindset. Subjects were specimens, units, items. But the dehumanizing language was just the surface. The prosecution presents evidence that's even more damning. Documents showing the doctors understood they were violating established ethics and deliberately concealing their actions. A memo from the T4 Administrative Office instructs physicians to vary the causes of death on death certificates. Don't list pneumonia too frequently. Alternate between heart failure, stroke, and various infections. The reason given. To avoid arousing suspicion among family members. This isn't the language of people conducting legitimate medical procedures. This is the language of people covering up crimes. Another document discusses the disposal of bodies from medical experiments. Standard protocol was immediate cremation. But one memo specifically instructs doctors to ensure all identifying marks are removed first. All prisoner tattoos, identification numbers, anything that could connect a specific body to a specific person, then cremate quickly. The ashes from multiple bodies were mixed together before being sent to families. Why take these precautions if the experiments were legitimate? The prosecution asks this repeatedly. If these were lawful medical procedures conducted under proper authority, why the elaborate concealment? The defense has no good answer. They try to argue this was standard wartime security, protecting classified research from enemy intelligence. But the prosecution presents another document that destroys that argument. An internal memo from 1942 discusses whether to publish findings from the freezing experiments in medical journals. The memo notes that the research produced valuable data. It could advance German military medicine, but it concludes that publication is inadvisable because it would reveal the unconventional methods used to obtain the data. Unconventional methods. That's the euphemism they chose for torture and murder. The memo goes further. It suggests that if any findings are published, the methodology section should be deliberately vague, should avoid mentioning that subjects were concentration camp prisoners, should imply the experiments were conducted on volunteers or simulation models, deliberate falsification of research methods. This proved the doctors knew their work couldn't withstand scrutiny, knew it violated medical ethics so fundamentally that even describing it honestly was impossible. The prosecution then presents another category of linguistic evidence, the evolution of euphemisms in Nazi medical documents. Early T4 documents use the phrase mercy death. By 1941, that's replaced with special treatment. By 1942, it's further sanitized to disinfection and transfer to special institutions, each euphemism more abstract than the last, each one creating more distance between the language and the reality of murder. But in private correspondence between doctors, the euphemisms sometimes drop away entirely. A letter from one T4 physician to another discusses eliminating patients and refers to the program's goal of cleansing institutions. Another letter uses the phrase life unworthy of life without any clinical justification, just a blunt assertion that certain people don't deserve to exist. The prosecution brings in linguistic experts who testify about the function of this language. It served two purposes. First, it created psychological distance for the perpetrators. Calling someone a material makes it easier to harm them than calling them a person. Second, it provided deniability. If documents were ever discovered, the language could be defended as metaphorical or technical. But some documents contain language so explicit there was no defense possible. One letter from a doctor at Hadamar facility discusses the daily quota of killings and complains that transports are arriving faster than bodies can be cremated. He requests authorization to add a second crematorium shift to increase throughput. Throughput, the language of factory production applied to mass murder. The prosecution also presents testimony from secretaries and clerks who typed these documents. One woman testifies that she was instructed to use carbon paper to make only 2 copies of certain memos. The originals and copies were to be stored separately. Standard memoranda required 5 copies. These sensitive documents required minimal duplication to limit their distribution. Someone was thinking about what would happen if these files were ever discovered. Another clerk testifies about document destruction. In April 1945, as Allied forces approached, she was ordered to burn entire filing cabinets of medical records. Not all records. Specifically the ones related to the T4 program and medical experiments. Standard patient files were left intact. Only the evidence of crimes was destroyed. She describes working for 3 days straight, feeding documents into an incinerator, thousands of pages. Many defendants personally supervised this destruction, pointing out which files to burn. This testimony proves consciousness of guilt. People who believe they're conducting legitimate medical research don't destroy their data as enemy forces approach. They preserve it. They protect it. These doctors destroyed evidence because they knew it incriminated them. The prosecution presents one final document in this category, a letter from Dr. Karl Brandt to a colleague dated August 1944. By this point, Germany is clearly losing the war. Brandt writes about his concerns for what comes after. He suggests that certain program records should be secured and that participants should coordinate testimony regarding the medical necessity of various procedures. This is a doctor planning his legal defense a year before the war ends, planning how to justify actions he knows will be judged criminal. The tribunal hears all of this evidence in a matter of days, document after document, letter after letter, a paper trail of consciousness of guilt. The defendants sit in the dock, hearing their own words read aloud. Euphemisms that seem protective when written now sounding like confessions. The defense tries one more argument. They claim that medical ethics in Nazi Germany were different, that the Reich had established its own ethical framework based on racial biology and national priority, that the doctors were following the ethical standards of their time and place, not violating them. The prosecution was ready for this argument too, because they had evidence that medical ethics were never officially rewritten in Nazi Germany, that the Hippocratic tradition was still taught in medical schools throughout the Reich, that doctors still took oaths to protect patient welfare, and most importantly, that some doctors refused to participate and faced no consequences. The evidence showed that these defendants made choices. They chose to participate. They chose to prioritize ideology over ethics. They chose to use their medical knowledge to harm rather than heal. And they chose to conceal their actions because they knew, even by the standards they claimed to follow, what they were doing was wrong. But the prosecution had one more category of evidence to present, one more revelation that would eliminate the last possible defense. Evidence showing that these doctors weren't following orders. They weren't coerced. They were ambitious professionals who saw the Nazi regime as an opportunity, who competed for positions, who innovated new methods of killing, who took initiative to expand the programs. Evidence of enthusiasm, not reluctance. And that would be the seventh revelation. April 1947. The prosecution presents personnel files from the Reich medical system. These aren't criminal evidence in the traditional sense. They're employment records, performance reviews, salary histories, promotion requests, and they reveal something the defendants never wanted exposed. These doctors weren't reluctant participants forced into horrific duties. They were ambitious professionals who saw Nazi medical programs as career opportunities. Let me show you a specific case. Dr. August Hirt, a professor of anatomy at Strasbourg University. His personnel file shows a pattern. In 1941, he proposes a research project to the SS. He wants to create a collection of Jewish skeleton specimens for anthropological study. The proposal is detailed, professional, and enthusiastic. He outlines exactly how many subjects he needs, what measurements he'll take, how the specimens will be preserved. He requests funding, laboratory space, and support staff. The proposal is approved. Hirt is given access to Auschwitz concentration camp to select subjects. His correspondence shows him personally choosing prisoners based on specific physical characteristics: height, bone structure, skull measurements. He treats this like a shopping expedition. In one letter, he complains that the quality of available subjects at Auschwitz isn't adequate and requests access to a different camp. Ultimately, 86 Jewish prisoners were killed specifically to supply Hirt's skeleton collection. They were transported to Natzweiler Struthof camp, where they were gassed. Their bodies were then sent to Hirt's laboratory in Strasbourg, where he had them macerated and articulated for display. This wasn't an order from above, this was a research proposal from below. An ambitious professor seeing an opportunity to advance his academic career and taking initiative to make it happen. The prosecution presents dozens of similar cases. Dr. Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz, though not on trial, provides another clear example. His personnel file shows he volunteered for camp duty. He requested assignment to Auschwitz specifically because of the research opportunities. His superiors noted in performance reviews that he showed exceptional initiative and enthusiasm for scientific work. Performance reviews, think about that. These programs had performance evaluations. Doctors were rated on their productivity, their innovation, their dedication. The bureaucratic apparatus of normal professional life applied to industrial murder. The prosecution presents salary records for several defendants. Dr. Karl Brandt's income increased dramatically between 1939 and 1944. His base salary as Hitler's physician was supplemented by additional payments for his administrative role in the euthanasia program. He received bonuses for exceptional service. He was promoted multiple times. By 1944, he held the rank of Gruppenführer in the SS. equivalent to a major general. This wasn't a man being forced into distasteful duties. This was a man building a career. His financial records show he purchased property, invested in businesses, maintained a comfortable lifestyle. The blood money of mass murder funded a prosperous professional life. The prosecution also presents evidence of competition between doctors. Multiple physicians conducting similar experiments at different camps, each one trying to produce results first, publish findings first, gain recognition first. A memo from Dr. Sigmund Rascher complains that another doctor is conducting freezing experiments at Auschwitz and might publish before him. He requests priority access to subjects at Dachau so he can accelerate his research timeline. This is academic competition, the same dynamic that drives research at universities, applied to torture and murder. The tribunal also hears evidence of doctors proposing expansions of existing programs. The T4 euthanasia program initially targeted institutionalized patients, but doctors submitted proposals to expand it, to include elderly people in nursing homes, to include chronic hospital patients, to include disabled veterans. Each proposal came from physicians, not from political leadership. Each one offered medical justification for why the new category should be added. One particularly chilling proposal came from a pediatrician who suggested expanding the child euthanasia program to include orphans with minor behavioral problems. His reasoning? These children would likely become burdens on the state in adulthood, so eliminating them early was preventive medicine. The proposal was submitted voluntarily, with detailed cost-benefit analysis and projected savings to the Reich. The prosecution presents testimony from junior doctors who witnessed their superiors' enthusiasm for these programs. One witness describes a senior physician at his hospital who volunteered to serve on a T4 review committee. The physician boasted about his role at staff meetings. He framed it as an honor, a recognition of his professional judgment. He encouraged younger doctors to seek similar opportunities. Another witness testifies about a conference in Berlin in 1942, where doctors presented findings from medical experiments. The atmosphere was collegial, academic, professional. Doctors networked, exchanged ideas, discussed methodologies. One presenter described innovative injection techniques for euthanasia that reduced drug costs. Another discussed optimal temperature ranges for freezing experiments. The presentations received applause. The research was treated as legitimate science. The defense tries to argue these doctors were operating within a system that normalized these behaviors, that the Nazi regime created an environment where medical ethics were corrupted, that individual doctors can't be held responsible for systemic failures. The prosecution responds with a simple counterexample. Dr. Hans Serlman, a physician at a psychiatric hospital in Saxony. In 1940, he received orders to begin selecting patients for the T4 program. He refused. He wrote a letter to the Reich Health Ministry stating that he could not participate because it violated his medical oath. He offered his resignation. His resignation was accepted. He was transferred to a different position. He continued practicing medicine throughout the war. He faced no punishment, no imprisonment, no professional sanctions. The prosecution presents records showing similar cases. Dr. Johann Neuner refused to participate in child euthanasia. He was reassigned. Dr. Mathilde Weber, a nurse, refused to administer lethal injections. She requested transfer. It was granted. Multiple medical professionals who refused to participate in killing programs and suffered no consequences. This evidence demolished the following order's defense. It proved that refusal was possible, that doctors had agency, that the defendants in the dock made choices. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence in this category, something that showed the depth of professional ambition driving these crimes, academic publications. Several defendants had published papers based on data from medical experiments. They submitted these papers to peer-reviewed journals. They listed concentration camp research on their academic CVs. They cited this work in applications for professorships and research grants. Dr. Karl Gebhardt published findings from his Ravensbrück surgical experiments. He presented them at the German Surgical Society conference in 1943. The audience included leading German physicians. No one objected. No one questioned the ethics. The research was accepted as legitimate contribution to medical knowledge. This revealed something profound about the corruption of German medicine under the Nazis. It wasn't just a few criminal doctors conducting secret experiments. It was a significant portion of the medical establishment participating, approving, and professionally benefiting from crimes against humanity. The prosecutors made their final point. These defendants weren't monsters. They were doctors. Educated, intelligent, accomplished professionals who made deliberate choices to use their knowledge and skills for evil. Who saw opportunities in the Nazi system and pursued them. Who competed for positions administering death. Who innovated new methods of killing. Who built careers on mountains of corpses. And that brought the prosecution to its final category of evidence. The one that would transform this trial from a historical judgment into a blueprint for the future. Evidence showing why this trial mattered beyond punishing these specific defendants. why these crimes required a new framework of international law, why medical ethics needed to be codified in ways that could never be violated again. That was the eighth revelation, the one that would reach forward into the future and shape how medicine is practiced to this day. July 1947, the prosecution presents its closing arguments. But before discussing guilt or sentencing, lead prosecutor Brigadier General Telford Taylor addresses something larger. He argues that this trial requires the creation of new legal principles, that existing law is inadequate to address what these doctors did, that the world needs a framework to prevent this from ever happening again. The tribunal agrees, and from this trial emerges a document that will transform medical practice worldwide. The Nuremberg Code, 10 Principles of Ethical Human Experimentation, written directly in response to the evidence presented in this courtroom. Let me show you why this matters. Principle 1. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This seems obvious now, but before Nuremberg, there was no internationally recognized requirement for informed consent in medical research. Doctors had broad discretion to experiment on patients, prisoners, and institutionalized people. The evidence from this trial proved why that discretion was dangerous. Every single experiment conducted by Nazi doctors violated what would become this first principle. Every prisoner, every child, every psychiatric patient was subjected to procedures without consent. The code continues. Experiments must have valid scientific purpose, must avoid unnecessary suffering, must be conducted by qualified personnel, must allow subjects to withdraw at any time, must be terminated if continuation appears likely to result in death or injury. Each principle directly responds to evidence presented at this trial. The high-altitude experiments that had no scientific value, the freezing tests that caused unnecessary suffering, the experiments conducted by doctors with no relevant training, the subjects who begged to be released but were forced to continue, the tests that continued even after multiple deaths. The Nuremberg Code transforms the evidence of crimes into principles of prevention. It says, this happened, here's proof, now here's how we ensure it never happens again. But the code alone isn't punishment. The tribunal must also deliver verdicts. August 20th, 1947. After 139 days of trial, the judges announced their decision. Of the 23 defendants, 7 are sentenced to death by hanging, Karl Brandt among them. 9 receive prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 are acquitted. The death sentences are carried out on June 2nd, 1948, at Landsberg Prison. The condemned doctors walked to the gallows just as thousands of their victims walked to gas chambers. The parallel is intentional, but here's what many people don't understand about this trial. The verdicts, the sentences, even the executions, these aren't the most important legacy. The most important legacy is the code. Because the code doesn't just judge the past, it governs the future. Today, every clinical trial, every medical experiment, every research protocol in the developed world must comply with principles that emerged from this courtroom. When you sign a consent form before a medical procedure, that's Nuremberg. When researchers must get ethics board approval before starting studies, that's Nuremberg. When drug trials require informed consent from participants, that's Nuremberg. The doctors in the dock at Nuremberg didn't just face justice for their crimes. They inadvertently created the ethical framework that governs modern medicine. Their violations became definitions. Their crimes became principles. The evidence of what they did became the standard for what can never be done again. The prosecution understood this from the beginning. They weren't just trying defendants. They were trying an idea. The idea that medical knowledge can justify any action. That scientific advancement outweighs individual rights. That doctors can decide who deserves life and who deserves death. The tribunal rejected that idea completely. The judges ruled that medical ethics cannot be subordinated to state ideology. That the physician's duty to the individual patient supersedes any duty to society or government. That there are moral boundaries science cannot cross regardless of potential benefits. This created tension that still exists today. How do we balance medical advancement with ethical constraints? How much risk can we accept in research? When does the promise of future benefit justify present harm? We're still wrestling with these questions. But the Nuremberg trial gave us a starting point, a line that cannot be crossed, principles that cannot be violated. So let me bring this back to where we started. December 9th, 1946. 23 doctors in a courtroom, boxes of evidence wheeled in on carts, names of victims read into the record. What happened over the next 9 months wasn't just a trial. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between medicine as it should be practiced and medicine as it was corrupted. The 8 categories of evidence we've walked through built on each other perfectly. The paper trail, proving system, and intent. The experiments proving these weren't scientists, but torturers. The children proving these weren't military necessities, but ideological murders. The assembly line procedures proving industrial-scale killing. The survivor testimony proving the human cost. The language proving consciousness of guilt. The career ambition proving voluntary participation. And finally, the code, proving that something new had to emerge from this horror. Each category removed another layer of defense. Each revelation made denial more impossible. By the end, the defendants had nowhere to hide. Quick reminder before we close, if you found this analysis valuable and you haven't already, please take a second to hit that like button. It genuinely helps the algorithm and lets me know this kind of in-depth historical content resonates with you. Those 8 categories of evidence from the doctor's trial: paper trail, experiments designed to kill, children as victims, assembly line murder, survivor testimony, language of concealment, professional ambition, and the creation of the Nuremberg Code. Notice what connects them. Each one proved not just what these doctors did, but why they did it. Not forced participation, but voluntary evil. Not ignorance, but knowledge. Not following orders, but taking initiative. The trial proved that education doesn't prevent atrocity, that professional credentials don't ensure ethics, that intelligence can be weaponized, that the same knowledge used to heal can be perverted to harm. These weren't monsters who infiltrated medicine. These were physicians who chose monstrosity. And that's the lesson that echoes forward 78 years to today. The structures exist: the Nuremberg Code, international ethics boards, informed consent requirements, human rights frameworks. But structures alone aren't enough, because the doctors at Nuremberg operated within structures too. They had ethics codes, they took oaths, they belonged to professional societies. What failed wasn't the absence of rules. What failed was the willingness to follow them when ideology demanded otherwise. So here's the question I want you to think about. Which of these 8 revelations disturbs you most? Was it the systematic killing of children, the experiments with no scientific value, the career ambition driving participation, the language of dehumanization? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every response, and I'm genuinely curious how you process this history. And here's a deeper question. We have the Nuremberg Code now. We have international law. We have ethics boards and oversight. But do we have the moral courage to refuse when authority demands we violate ethics? Would we be the doctors who resigned or the doctors who participated? The Nuremberg doctors' trial proved that professional credentials mean nothing without moral courage, that following orders is a choice, not an obligation, that medicine, the profession dedicated to healing, can become an instrument of death when ethics are subordinated to ideology. Those lessons cost hundreds of thousands of lives to learn. The question is whether we've learned them well enough to prevent the next atrocity. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep historical analysis like this, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.